In the remote village of Ilra, nestled on the edge of an ancient forest, people lived with a shadow looming over their lives. They whispered of a curse haunting the woods once the sun set, calling it the Shadowed Forest, where reality twisted and the boundary between the living and the dead blurred. The villagers spoke of shadow hunters, sinister beings that lured the lost into the forest. Some claimed they wore the faces of loved ones, while others said they had no faces at all. Those who entered the forest were never seen again, becoming part of cautionary tales. For most, the curse was a story to keep children from wandering. But for 18-year-old Elena, it was personal. Her parents vanished into the forest when she was a child, leaving her and her brother Kale to fend for themselves. The memory of their loss remained sharp. When Kale, now 12, claimed to hear their parents calling from the forest, Elena's fears came true. One rainy night, Kale disappeared, leaving muddy footprints leading into the woods. With no choice, Elena grabbed her father's lantern and followed. The rain fell heavily as Elena stood at the forest's edge, her lantern barely piercing the darkness. She hesitated, staring into the tangled trees. "Kale!" she shouted, but the forest swallowed her voice. Her heart pounded as she stepped forward. The deeper she ventured, the stranger the forest became. The air felt thick, pressing against her lungs. Then she heard it, a soft, familiar voice. Elena! It was her mother's voice, warm and melodic. Her feet froze. "Mom?" she whispered, trembling. The voice came again, closer. "Elena, my brave girl, come to me." She moved forward instinctively, torn between logic and longing. The lantern's light caught a figure ahead, blurred by rain, beckoning. "We've missed you," it said, its tone affectionate. Elena's heart twisted, torn between logic and longing. But then she noticed the figure's hand. It was wrong, too long and thin, fingers curling like claws. "Kale!" she shouted, forcing herself to look away. She ran, lantern swinging, casting erratic shadows. Elena's lungs burned as she ran, slipping on muddy ground. The forest seemed alive, mocking her escape. Her father's lantern was her only solace, its light repelling shadows. She clung to it desperately, her fingers aching from the cold and strain. Suddenly, she stumbled into a clearing. The rain stopped, and the air felt still. In the center stood an ancient tree, its roots sprawling. At its base sat Kale, hunched and trembling. "Kale!" Elena called, relief flooding her voice. He turned, pale and tear-streaked. "I heard them," Elena, Kale whispered. "I heard Mom and Dad. They said they're waiting for us." Before Elena could respond, shadows around the clearing shifted. Dark figures emerged, twisting like smoke. They had no eyes, just hollow darkness where faces should be. One shadow stepped forward, wearing her mother's face. "Elena," it said sweetly, "you've been so brave. Come home to us. Bring Kale." Elena tightened her grip on the lantern. "You're not my mother," she said, her voice steady despite fear. The figure's expression shifted grotesquely. "We can be whatever you want," it said. "Just let the light go." "It's tiring, isn't it? Holding on so tightly." Shadows closed in, coiling like snakes. Elena glanced at Kale, who stared at the shadow, eyes wide. "Kale, close your eyes!" Elena shouted, lunging toward him, grabbing his arm. The shadows hissed, movements frantic as the lantern's light swept across them. "Run!" she yelled, dragging Kale as they bolted back into the forest, shadows surging after them. The lantern's light flickered, its flames sputtering as if darkness tried to snuff it out. The forest seemed endless, trees blurring in a dizzying maze. Elena's legs burned, breath ragged, but she didn't stop. Kale stumbled beside her, clutching her hand tightly. Finally, they burst through the tree line, the forest spitting them into the open. Village lights flickered in the distance, a stark contrast to the darkness left behind. Elena collapsed, the lantern slipping from her grasp. Kale clung to her, trembling. "They almost had me," Kale whispered, voice cracking. "I thought they were real." Elena held him close, tears mixing with rain. "They weren't real, Kale. But we are. We made it." As she looked back, the forest shadows seemed to retreat, defeated, at least for now.